afternoon. My name is Krista Matheson, and I'll be your moderator for today's Cabinet Outs. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the Premier of Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil. We'll now take questions from the room.
Premier, I wonder if we could start by getting your reaction to some of the criticism that has followed the announcement that you made on Tuesday, particularly that some folks feel like, A, they were not consulted, and B, that your government has already had proposals related to justice reform that it hasn't really looked at and explored.
I think what we announced on Monday, Tuesday was the design team that will lay out a restorative approach to look at public safety in the province. That's in essence the work that's coming forward. My understanding is people were didn't have an issue with the people that were at the table. It is not only is it government, it is community, it is public safety across the province who are at that table, and they're building a design program or design format that will actually include all members of that community, very much as we did with the restorative process for the Home for Colored Children. And one of the recommendations coming out of that was dealing with the restorative approach, which really is allowing the community to create the design, and that's what we announced.
So is that to say then that consultation is coming, it just hasn't happened yet, or do you take the point that some people have made that maybe you should have come and talked to us even before getting to the point where you had an announcement to make on Tuesday?
Well, one of the challenges, one of the criticisms towards government has always been that we impose a solution. Well, this is just the opposite. It's actually allowing the design team to go out and engage with community, the very things people have asked us for. That doesn't mean that issues that have been brought to government won't be part of this. Of course they'll be brought to the table, but it will be community and government and our public safety institutions at the table, all hearing from one another at the same time. And that's to me what's the genesis of all of this is the fact that it's actually community. We didn't go in and say, here's the solution. We're actually in the communities have been engaged, and they'll continue to be engaged. And it'll be the broader community. It'll be all those that you've heard from and people that we haven't heard from yet, whose voices will be part of this conversation.
And just finally, you mentioned people have pretty well been positive about the group of people that were announced on Tuesday. Could you speak a little bit about how that group was selected, how that list of people came to be?
Yeah, that was put together by the facilitators who were there, who reached out into community looking at, and it's pretty straightforward who would be there from government. It would be obviously those departments that have been impacted. We wanted to make sure that there were people from across the province, so those names were brought forward and recommended. And quite frankly, the fact that people have endorsed them is a positive thing. And I think people will feel the benefit of the community engagement as the design process continues out. And it will be community who will be at that table, and it will be the broad community.
Why wasn't the community, though, more consulted? I know you said there was some consultation with community members about the creation of this team, but what I'm hearing from community members in the African Nova Scotian community, particularly leaders in that community, say they had no idea this team was being created. They are somebody who would have liked to be consulted. They maybe would have liked to participate in some fashion. So I'm just wondering, why the community at large wasn't fully consulted.
There are leaders all across this province in the African Nova Scotia community. Some of them were tapped to work before for the province. Some are being encouraged now, but it was really through the restorative approach and the co-leads that would be identifying people to be part of that. The government representatives are pretty straightforward. It would be justice, obviously, the new integrated portfolio that we have. Community services would be part of that conversation. But then it was reached out into communities, and they will be consulted. Those who that I've read about and I've heard about it in different newscasts, the design team will be reaching out into community to hear from them, but to hear from all stakeholders across this province, all community members, not just the ones that you've interviewed, but others. We overwhelmingly have had support from the African Nova Scotia community in this process, one that I'm looking forward to see it to its final conclusion.
Are you concerned that possibly the fact that communities like North Preston are upset that they don't see themselves on this community, that they won't participate in this process, and therefore you won't get the input that you say you will, that the government wants to hear.
Well, I hope everyone participates in, but that'll ultimately be the decision of individuals. The design team, which is now working, will be out engaging communities from one end of the province to the other, just as we did in the other restorative process that we did around the home. It wasn't sitting in a boardroom in Halifax. The design team and the final committee went out actually in communities, engaged, talked directly to members of their community to get their input, and that's exactly what will happen this time.
We have another self-regulating Indigenous fishery supposedly kicking off today in Cape Breton with Buckledeck. I'm wondering whether you view this as a positive development or is it counterproductive given the unrest we've seen up around Digby?
I think everyone wants clarity, and I think the Federal Department of Fisheries needs to come together with the Mi'kmaq as well as the commercial fishermen across this province to find a path forward. More often, if we continue to have unregulated fisheries happening where people are not necessarily sure what's going on, I think it just causes more uncertainty. So it's more than ever critical that the DFO gets to the table with the Indigenous fishermen in this province as well as the commercial fishermen to find a path forward so that they can commit and meet the Marshall decision that spoke around a moderate livelihood.
But in the absence of that, do you have any problem with the fact that they're actually starting another fishery? Do you think they have the absolute right to do it until this stuff is clarified?
Well, the Marshall decision said they have a right to a moderate livelihood. For 21 years, no one has actually defined that. I think they've all tried. I think it's critical, though, that they come to the table as we're in this moment of time. Today's Treaty Day. DFO needs to be at the table with all sides. I think one of our challenges is that we have meetings with DFO, meeting with the Indigenous fishery, and then meeting with the commercial fishery, and not everyone at the same time. So we get a sense of everyone can fully understand what it is each side is talking about.
Do you feel like DFO, the federal government, is really picking up on this?
Listen, as I said before, 2 weeks ago, I believed that all three, the commercial fishery, Indigenous fishery, as well as DFO, need to be at the table to find a solution. They're obviously working their way through that. I've heard Chief Sack talk a bit more recently, but this is not going away, and it's been 21 years in the making. The courts have made a decision around the Marshall decision. Now all sides have to come together to fully implement what that really meant around the issue of a moderate livelihood.
Mr. Kasoulis left cabinet this week so that he could seek the leadership.
Is it your plan to wait until the deadline to know exactly how many people have left cabinet before replacing them, or do you think you're going to do that on a case-by-case basis leading up to that date?
No, I'll wait and see who else is going, if anyone else is going, and then make a decision of who will be in those departments or who to go portfolios.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there.
No.
Is it a challenge at all if you end up losing 3 or even 4 cabinet ministers? Does that create a challenge for you to try to fill those vacancies? You've got the majority, but it's not a large majority, and so you don't have as many people perhaps to choose from as you would have in, say, your first mandate.
No, it's not a problem at all. I said one of the things I've been fortunate about in the last 7 years of being elected with quality people. There are people who did not make it into cabinet simply out of sheer numbers and geography that would have made it in most other cabinets. So it won't be a problem for me to fill those positions, but we'll see who's going in first.
Do you expect you're going to bring new people into cabinet, or will you assign some of those roles in the short term to other ministers?
I'll see who goes first. I don't know who's going. I know we know one, Mr. Kasoulis. Labby's gone, so we'll wait and see if someone else goes.
Who is going to take on these duties in the interim until you reach?
We typically, for all of our ministers, we have acting ministers who cover it. So if someone's out of town or on vacation, so that's what will happen in this moment in time for the short period, and then I'll put someone more permanently in there after the 9th.
And have you had any conversations with other ministers about them leaving?
No, I've talked to let me clarify that.
Okay.
I've talked to everyone who's considering. No one else has told me they're going. So I got calls outside of cabinet too. So people have, people out in the community have called me about, just wanting to talk to me and opinion and thoughts on it. So, but nobody else in cabinet has told me they're going, or no private members told me they're going, or no one else told me they're going.
Premier, you're 7 years into your government 10-year commitment to move disabled people out of institutions to clear the DSP wait list, but that wait list is increasing year by year, and hundreds of people still remain in these institutions. So is your government still committed to clearing that wait list and closing these institutions by 2023?
So the most recent budget had funding to move 50 people out into community. We've committed to 70 additional people per year over the next number of years to continue to ensure that we move people back into community as quickly as possible.
So are you committed to meeting that 2023 deadline?
We're on path to do that, and we're committed to do that. I think we also have to recognize people will choose where they want to live. So we have some people who consider those institutions their home. So they make a decision where they want to live, but we're working with families and working with members of the community to move people out. As I said, our current budget had funding for 50, and there's an additional 70 per year for the next 3 or 4 years.
I asked this week about
The wood heating projects that were announced on Monday about the contract costs, and I was told we can't have that information. I'm going to ask Minister Rankin to clarify that in particular, but I wanted to ask you more in general. Can we expect to see that sort of response on other P3 projects when contracts are awarded? Are we not going to be able to get the sort of information that's routinely released?
No, I don't think so. I believe there's some requests in around some of the health P3s that will be going through. I think one of the issues with these wood heat ones, I believe there's another round of an RFP going out, and there's probably some proprietary stuff that I think they're holding in, but Mr. Rank would be able to answer that for you better.
Right, but just to be clear,
You don't expect that when other P3 contracts are awarded that we won't be able to find out how much the people of Nova Scotia are paying?
No, I don't. No, I expect you should be able to find out what you wouldn't get, whether there's a proprietary situation. I think in the health P3 stuff, once they're awarded, finalized, that stuff should be able to be released because it's just a single project, if you know what I mean. In this case, I think Minister Rank will be able to answer this better, but I believe we are doing another round, an RFP will be going on, and there's some information in those current ones that we would that would be proprietary, and they want to wait until this second RFP gets done, is my understanding.
Minister of Commerce is looking or is wondering whether or not there's ways to kind of open up a bit more with the economy. Are you looking at lifting any additional restrictions right now?
We will continue to work with public health when it comes to any restrictions associated, and it'll be focused on advice from public health. But we don't have any today. No.
Is there any step in between?
Yesterday by the Education Department says you've got a widespread issue with lead in water in Nova Scotia schools. What are you going to do to make sure the department has the resources to tackle that issue?
Well, first of all, I want to say to parents in every school across this province, there's drinking water that is safe for their children to be drinking. The minister had received the report. There's a number of facilities that are, there's no issue with them. He would know the percentage better than I think. I don't know whether he's coming out today or not, whether you've asked for him. And we will work with the department to ensure that we deal with the issues of lead in the drinking water in our schools. As you remember, we had met the standard. The federal government has changed the standard. It's not unique to Nova Scotia. Really across the country we're seeing this happen. In some cases it may potentially be pipes in an actual leading into the facility. In other cases it's actually the appliance that's delivering the water, so they would have to be changed out, but the minister would have more detail on it.
Do you have a timeline in mind in which you'd like to see that done?
Well, obviously, we're going to work as quickly as possible to ensure that we're having drinking water at the tap in our schools. The minister's working on, what are the appliances that are out there to be able to deliver that water. We're also in the midst of a pandemic with COVID and other viruses that potentially around. I'm sure he'll look at is there touchless fountains, those kinds of things that he can be able to, that we'll be able to use used. But now that the report is in, I would suspect that we'll start moving that very quickly.
I'm going to go to the phones. I have Jean Laroche with CBC on the line with questions for the Premier. Go ahead, Jean.
Thanks, Chrissy. Premier, I just wondered, in relation to the working group that you announced this week, I asked someone in your office, but they have not got back to me on how much money has been set aside to actually fund the work of this group. Could you tell me?
Somewhere, the exact number varies a little bit, but it'd be based on once we get the final details. But I expect the 18 months will be around 1 to 1.2 million.
And could you tell me who will approve the terms of reference for this design team? Because I've been told that they are working out their own terms of reference, but I would imagine somebody will have to sign off on that.
So ultimately what's happening, and this is the restorative approach. This is the same approach that we took actually with the Home for Colored Children. We actually went out into the community. And we allowed the design team to design the appropriate mechanism that worked for the voices, the members of the home. In this case, what it will be, the design team has been given the authority to go and work with community. Every community across the province to put in place, and also including with law enforcement and the department to look at what is the best path to provide a different model of public safety. And they will come back with that recommendation. I can tell you, the only way this will work, quite honestly, is they need the authority to be able to follow the path that they believe is in the best, that the community believes in the best interest. People find it hard to believe that government is giving over its authority. We're going to the table as an equal. There will be members there as representing government, but they'll have no greater voice than that of members in the community, probably less. Law enforcement will be there, and they will determine it's less about terms of reference and more about the broader scope of how we deal with the issue of public safety when it comes to the African Nova Scotia, Indigenous, and marginalized Nova Scotians. We need a system that works for all of us, and quite frankly, that's not the case today.
We're going to go back to the room.
Premier, the federal COVID-19 app, the tracing app, I'm just wondering if the province is looking at adopting that, and
We're signing on now.
And so when would we potentially have it up by?
I hope as soon as possible, but in the near future. There's a few details we have to sign off with the federal government, and then we'll announce it, but we're signing off on it, yeah. It'll be one piece of how we deal with the issue of COVID.
Look, Dr. Strang previously, I think, had some apprehensions about, and obviously he's not here to speak to this, but do you have a sense of what has changed over the last couple of weeks to get public health to a comfort level with that, where you're now able to sign on?
I mean, I don't want to speak for him. He'll speak, but it's not. I don't know if I think the question about signing on. They were looking at what would that mean in terms of testing in our province. With what capacity could we handle the extra capacity? All of that, as you know, we're ramping up our own testing model here. So I think that question was alleviated, and it's just one more option that we can use to continue to track the virus in our own province. So it is. We haven't seen across the country a massive uptake. We've seen a massive uptake in terms of people downloading the app, but we haven't seen the systems be overburdened by an extra group of testing that would cause us to worry about the fact that those active cases or the cases that we know directly have been touched by the virus wouldn't get into the queue and be tested in a timely manner.
And just on the, if we stick with testing for a second, the change that was announced today.
Did I confuse you? Because I think I might have confused myself with that one, did I?
I think I followed.
Okay.
But on the change that was announced today to allow people to do the online assessment, to what extent is that change motivated by concerns that parents have voiced that they are having to take time off from work with their children to stay home while they wait just to hear back from 811 about whether or not they need to get a test?
That's been part of the concern. We've heard that from other people who've been waiting periods of time. It just eliminates that one extra step, because how this is going to work is that you do the online assessment. If it says you require a test, that will go directly into the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and then someone will call you back directly. As it's been working now, you would go through the A11, you would do the online test. If it said, you'd call A11, go through a few more questions, and A11 would call the health authority. So there was too many people between you and getting your appointment, and this online portal will speed that up. And it'll also, if I can, eliminate a lot of time that people are having when they're waiting just for someone to be able to answer when we had a high call volume into 811.
That's all the time that we have.
Can you give me an update on the tree inquiry, where you're at with that?
We're just waiting for Ottawa.
Minister, as you know, there are some folks who
were unhappy with some of the circumstances around Tuesday's announcement, vis-a-vis they felt like there ought to have been more heads up or consultation. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that reaction that some people have had, and whether or not you think it's a fair reaction.
Well, first of all, I would say that this whole process is designed to include everyone in the communities right across this province. As it's aptly named, it's the design team. That means it could be very fluid. There's a lot of work to go into it. Those folks who have responded in a not so happy way, I'd ask them to slow down and be calm. I'd ask them to give us a chance to begin the work and to allow us to get out there and consult with them and get their input.
Are you concerned that some communities, like North Preston, for example, might not participate in this because they don't feel like they're represented?
It's hard for me to hear you, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just taking this off, actually. I don't know why I still have it on. I'm just wondering, are you concerned that you won't get adequate participation? Some communities might not participate, and therefore you won't get the input that you might otherwise get if people felt they're represented on the design team.
I'm not concerned at all, because I truly believe that those that are on the design team come from a very broad cross-section of people within the community and elsewhere. And I do believe, with the intent and the way it's laid out, the idea is to get to all those communities. Now, you mentioned North Preston. North Preston being one of the largest black communities in Metro, they would not be forgotten. They would not be left out.
Mr., to what extent do you think that the negative side of the reaction to Tuesday is rooted in the fact that a lot of people just simply have a mistrust for government when it comes to this kind of thing? Like they've heard the promise before, they've seen no results, people were still getting street checked, and racism still exists within the justice system. To what extent do you think that contributes to the reaction?
Thank you. I think it contributes quite a bit, Mr. Gorman. I do believe, there's been a history of things not moving forward when the community has come ahead. I can only assure people that while I'm sitting here, while working and dealing with my colleagues and talking to the Premier, everybody knows. And I would suggest that from 2013, everybody who I'm associated with and working with have heard the concerns and are aware of the concerns, and everything that we are moving forward on is based on all that past history.
We're going to go to the phones to Jean Laroche. Jean Laroche has questions for Minister Ince.
Minister Ince, was the process to set this up simply too secretive?
I don't think so. I believe that when you're dealing with a whole new approach, there are going to be a lot of questions, and people will believe that things are done in secrecy. You've got to remember, while this is a design team, this design team also includes a whole new restorative approach, which is unusual for us, and this is a first. I mean, in the approach, in the way that they're going to be taking in this. People have to be patient, work with us, consult with us. Let us hear your voice. We will take those concerns and we will add that to everything that we are trying to improve.
Jean, go ahead with your follow-up.
That a lot of people knew nothing about it except those who were in the room, not undermine the message, which is, we're sorry, we're going to do something about it.
Well, and again, it's a design team. There has to be a first step. That is the first step. The next step is to ensure that we're out and hearing from the communities. By no means does a design team mean that what we've laid out is good and final. As I said, there's going to be ebbs and flows in all of this, and there's going to have to, people are going to have to allow us and the teams and everyone to work on this.
Jean, go ahead with another question, since you were the only one who submitted.
Merci. What does it say about the way this team was set up that 3 community groups are planning to protest about it in North Preston on Sunday, Minister?
Well, the community groups, they have a right to protest and voice their concerns. Again, I would say that people need to take a pause, step back, and allow all of us to be at the table so that we can address the concerns. While we're fighting, we're not going to be addressing the concerns. And for the first time in my life in this province, I see us actually moving in a direction with some concrete actions.
We'll go back to the room.
Minister, you said that this is just a first step and that you have to start somewhere, but I'm just wondering maybe why the first step wasn't opening up the process to actually create this design team. So maybe, you know, anyone who potentially wants to participate would have a shot at being part of the design team rather than just being potentially consulted by the design team down the road.
Well, again, the process, I believe, was a good process. I do believe that many folks in the community, this is just the first step. It doesn't mean that our first step will conclude at leaving everybody out or stopping. We have to grow. We have to come together. Let me say it to you this way. If I'm in my house and I'm having a discussion about my family, the first 2 people that are going to have that discussion are me and my wife. Then the rest of the people being consulted. Now, that may not be a great analogy for this, but that's the best way I can answer that for you right now.
But I think that's kind of the concern that community members are raising, is that it's kind of maybe those who are potentially somehow in with the government's choosing these initial people, and they feel like for years they've been raising issues, raising concerns, and now they're not part of this process.
But they will be part of the process.
But the process started and run by government. They kind of want to be the starting point, I guess.
But they have been. 20 years ago, they were complaining. Many of the community were complaining, brought references forward in conditions. Many of those same people who are speaking about but not being a part of it, they have been a part of it, and they continue to be a part of it, and they will continue to be a part of it.
That's all the time. Oh, one question more question for Andrew.
Minister, a lot of issues have been raised through the Home for Colored Children report. Recommendations have been made over and over. And there's a lot we know about barriers to healthcare, education, etc. What do you think can be learned through this process?
Well, that's a big question. I think what could be learned are all the concerns and questions that have been put forward by community over generations. I do believe that while there have been recommendations, there haven't been a lot of discussion or talk around it, you know, to really concretely find out how we would move forward. And I am optimistic and hoping that this is where we can move now and start to move the bar for all those issues that we've been waiting on for generations.
Back to LaRoche on the line for one more question. Go ahead, Jean LaRoche.
Minister, very briefly, the other criticism that has been leveled is that there are things the government has been asked to do on a number of fronts through a number of processes, and you haven't done it yet. How do you feel about that piece of criticism?
Well, criticism will often come when people aren't seeing concrete actions up front. As you know, and as everybody would know, we're dealing with a complex system. We're dealing with not only a systemic system that's been there for 400 years, but you're also dealing with a system that has not been set up or actually has had any intention to do what they should be doing. So when we are looking at trying to make these adjustments and changes, we all know it takes a long time, and there are complications through many steps of it.
And that's all the time that we have today.
Minister, thank you.
Up next, we will have Minister Rankin.
Thank you. Minister, on Monday we were, when your department announced the award of those contracts for the space heating in those buildings, we weren't told how much the public will be paying for those contracts. Do you have that information today?
No, on the advice of internal services who handles contracts, tendering, they said that it would be best to keep the proprietary information for the third party public and go through the regular FOIPOP process for them to do a full analysis of what is appropriate to disclose.
Why? Shouldn't the public know the global figure that it's spending on each of these contracts?
I had similar questions. I'd like to disclose them, but I'm following the advice of staff, and the reason they gave is we need to protect our negotiation in our position for the next round. As I said, we have 20 or 30 more buildings coming in the next round. Some of those will be much larger, and companies may look to bid on around the same level that they bid and were successful last time. We'll be expecting lower prices as we are able to scale up.
When is that next round of calls coming?
I don't have the exact date, but we'll be looking to have them in place for the next heating season, so virtually we'll have them in place by next fall.
Doesn't the fact that you have essentially a preferred list of people you're going to, you don't have to cast the net again, you've got this collection of people that were pre-approved, doesn't that, in a sense, limit the concerns about proprietary information, given that it's a handful of folks who are bidding on this? Presumably they even know each other. I guess I'm just failing to understand the issue here.
Again, I've asked similar questions. I try to be as open as I can, but I do have to follow the advice. I know there are suppliers outside of the ones that were approved in the first round, so we still have an option if we wanted to open it up for more suppliers. But to protect the competitive position of the province for future negotiations, we haven't disclosed that number.
Is this going to be the norm for P3 contracts where there's an additional level of secrecy?
I can't comment on other contracts. I just know that was the advice from internal services for these.
I'm really having a hard time grasping why it is that the public can't know how much the public is spending for contracts. Don't you, as an MLA, don't you find that a bit disturbing?
Well, I found out when the contracts came out, and I knew there would be a high level of interest, and that was the advice from staff. So I'll continue to ask questions that are similar to the ones that you're posing. I completely understand the desire to know, but I also appreciate the advice from the staff that work with tendering, and that's the position of the government today.
You feel obliged to take that advice, in other words?
At this juncture, I'm taking the advice, and I'll continue to ask those questions.
But you've seen the figures. Have you?
I've seen the figures.
Are you comfortable with the figures you've seen?
Of course, we went through a long and rigorous process in the tendering, and we had a mandate to negotiate the high end. Staff did a great job in working individually with each contract and driving the prices down, even scaling up prices or scaling up projects like the one in Bridgewater, adding on a district heating. That's the kind of direction that I want to see in the future is really district heating opportunities across multiple buildings. So we will be able to drive down prices. So I accept the premise that we will need to keep our negotiating position strong.
Oh, I'm sorry. Since we've got you out here, we found out earlier this week that the amount of chips going to the two biomass electricity boilers has increased in the last few months. Can you say to us today that that will only be a short-term play as the department and others seek other markets for that, or should people expect that for the foreseeable future, more biomass will be burned in this province to generate electricity?
That's not a long-term solution. That was addressing the need to meet our renewable energy commitments, which are legislated. That was an opportunity with Muskrat Falls not coming online when it was scheduled to. So in the balance of considerations, to use renewable chips from our local market seemed to be one that we should consider, and the alternative would have been having to import renewable electricity. So that helped a market that obviously had some challenges finding that end use. The alternative would have been leaving the chips to rot, and that carbon would have been not captured. So that was the right decision for that time, but it's not a long-term solution.
Do you have a date yet to make a decision on leadership?
Next week, I've said that I'll make that decision.
Or if you know more specifically, yeah.
Monday. Yeah.
And that's all the questions we have for Minister Rankin. Thank you. Okay, we'll go to questions in the room.
So tourism, the industry's been waiting a very long time for an answer. I know you've had some meetings with Tyans and others. Are you getting closer to having a program to announce?
Yeah, super close with the Dalhousie $50 million. So that announcement's imminent. It really is sort of day by day. Could be next week. They could be ready as early as tomorrow. And I don't have that officially. Just I know it's that close. So they'll put the finishing touches on what they see as that rollout, and then we'll obviously get a briefing and then go from there. Yeah, so certainly imminent, and I can attest to the tremendous patience that the sector has in waiting for a response and a connection in terms of policy to the $50 million.
Is the entire $50 million going to be directed at that sector?
It's certainly going to be directed towards tourism. I don't know for certain this was part of the independence that the Dow Group had in terms of, if it'll be X number of million to this and X to that, or is it one sort of injection into one program? I certainly think that given the magnitude of the impact on tourism and what's been requested vis-a-vis government support, both federally and provincially, I don't anticipate that the announcement of the $50 million, will be that magic wand that addresses all issues that we're hearing. But it'll certainly be a start. If it's $50 million crafted in a way that supports directly, it's going to help some, but as we've done all the way through here with policy, we roll it out, get a reaction from the stakeholders impacted, and then see what's next in terms of solving problems where we can.
Sorry guys, I just stop. I have to make sure that the phone line is working properly. I'm just doing a test on the phone line. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Back on.
You mentioned that the independence of Dow. Is Dow designing this, or is your department, or are you? Like, who's?
No, so it's been certainly, look, I wouldn't suggest that there's no input from the department, through the deputy or senior staff. We have conversations regularly. Brian, you referenced Tyans. They've been a tremendous support in terms of giving information, feedback, advice, and criticism where it's warranted. And then we funnel that through. So obviously, again, they are responsible for doing a lot of the deep dive with respect to what a program will look like. But we've certainly given an indication as to where, what the problem areas are, and what we would hope that they will try and address to the extent possible.
But Dow is making the final decision.
Well, look, they're going to design the program. Obviously, again, I don't want to be misleading here. This is public dollars, and if there was something from our perspective that was outlandish or missed the mark, we would certainly have the ability to pivot. But as I say, Deputy Miller, our team have had regular contact, so it's not as if this is going to, any of the final details will come as an extreme shock that we didn't anticipate. I don't think so.
I guess I've never quite understood why Dow was even tapped in the first place to begin distributing the province's money. It's never really explained, and I don't know who at Dow is doing this and why they've been given this latitude. They're not part of the public service.
Well, I think it's largely a capacity issue in terms of why we needed a third party and something of this nature. And again, thinking back, and you and I have been in contact the whole way through, Brian. It's been it's been challenging to figure out what the policy pieces look like. The money's a different thing, and you always need the money, but crafting that policy is critical, and then delivering. And if you look at, I don't have to highlight examples. I think you all would there'd be things that would come to mind federally, provincially, that may have not rolled out as quickly as they should have been, as efficient. And there's, again, all kinds of stories of third-party influence and involvement in rolling out the government program. So for us, looking at the Department of Business at the time in the throes of COVID, the other departments that were connected, just to administer, to make the contacts with the thousands of businesses that were required, thinking back just to the grant program alone, having third parties like the credit unions, like Dow, with their capacity, with their obviously business savvy, with the fact that they had access to a significant number of students who were senior students, co-op programs. It made sense that we would have a body that once we decided where we'd be going with investment and with a program, that it wouldn't be our resources that would have to put it together, because quite frankly, I don't think we could not have done it as efficiently.
Minister, $50 million is a lot of money. I don't mean to downplay it, but it's a drop in the bucket. We're talking about an industry that stands to lose more than $1 billion this year. Based on what you've seen and heard so far, what is your sense of how many folks might not actually exist come next tourism season? Yeah,
listen, good question. I think I couldn't put a number on it, Michael, but there's a lot of perilous situations out there. It's really it's as individual as the sector itself in terms of the magnitude of the problems. When you look at restaurants, smaller operations that were under the public closure order, or those who weren't under the public closure order but for all intents and purposes were, like retail. If by and large, and again, not speaking for everyone, but if they've survived to this point, the prospects look relatively decent compared to where they were in March and April. What you're seeing now are the larger players and some of the those that have the ability to carry debt and sort of manage the balance sheet, keep creditors at bay until now. They're really understanding. They know what the costs are going to be, and they could have predicted the costs in March what will look like in Q2 of next year. But the revenues were the part that was uncertain. Looking at a $900 million revenue year versus 2.7, looking at the fact that with what's being referred to in many jurisdictions as a second wave, which obviously impacts what the market demands are going to be, who's going to fly, who's going to travel, who's going to do those things, what we are going to do with respect to the Atlantic bubble. It's not a rosy picture when you look at the potential revenues coming into 2021. This is obviously going to be a multi-year impact for tourism. So who's going to survive and how they're going to survive, I don't think we could say definitively at this point, because there still are those factors. But $50 million is not going to cover the losses. There's no two ways about it.
I guess what I'm wondering is, when you think about the drive that you're about to do to go home, and for folks who would head up towards Inverness when they get past the causeway, that drive is dotted with all of these tiny little family operations that really make a year's worth of money off of 2 to 3 months at best, and they haven't done it do you think your government even has the capacity to help those folks get to next summer in hopes that it might be better than this one was?
Yeah, I think we do to a certain extent, and that again, Mike, depends on, that would be very individual. So again, there are restaurants along my drive that I'll make in a couple hours, that the injections of $5,000, the patient capital that they could access through the credit union, some of the rent deferral piece, that's a combination with the feds. Those things have been enough to get them to a relatively stable state present day. But what the future looks like moving forward, again, are we going to have if we have a $900 million season next year, that will be an important. That's an important sort of line in the sand to see if we're getting better. But if it's 1.6 billion, what does that mean for all of those, 1, 2, 4, 5 person restaurants, shops that employ that many people? So I think again, it's very hard to sort of make an overall statement about which businesses are going to be able to survive vis-a-vis or via government programs. There will be some, but we're not going to be able to save everyone by way of public dollar investment. So I think, hoping that there will be some natural market recoveries, the behavior of the traveling public next year will be significant. People seeing Nova Scotia as a relatively safe place to be is a good thing. But again, we rely so much on the tourists that come out from outside the Atlantic bubble, obviously. So, where the airlines are going to be, where the ferry's going to be, these things are significant and uncertain at this point, and a tremendous concern for us as a government, and downright terrifying if you're a tourism operator.
I'm going to go to the phones to Jean Laroche, who has questions for Minister McCollum. Go ahead, Jean.
Minister, obviously you can't make people whole in terms of their anticipated revenue. So what is the goal of the government with this $50 million? What are you hoping to accomplish, given, as my colleague put it so eloquently, it's a drop in the bucket?
Jean, this may be crass, and what comes to mind immediately on that question is to try to keep them afloat. That was the mandate, the sort of the mission statement for the original grant program in April, the loan programs, any of these deferrals that we were part of, any of the federal programs, I think would follow that philosophy. What can we do to get people by? And that's really what it is. Again, if you look at just in my response to Mike's question, if we have a relatively healthy tourism season compared to 900 million, that's a very different story than if we don't. So if it stays 900 million or it shrinks, we're in a lot more catastrophic range than we are now. So it's keeping people afloat. We don't know what the tourism revenues are going to look like. To be honest with you, I guess I'm somewhat an optimist and spoke in optimistic terms in the beginning, probably in the initial stages of what will be our normal tourism season, June, July, thinking that you would see a bit of a bounce back, and that was probably just wishful thinking, because the science and the data and the analytics didn't point to that. But we were hoping for a recovery. As we look at 2021 and what the season looks like, there's certainly some positive indicators based on returns that we've seen in some regions of the province, but that long-term tourism market, it would be hard to suggest that it's going to be robust next year. Again, not to digress too far into the weeds, but there's also things we can do as a government, Tourism Nova Scotia as a crown, around things like the seasonality. So tourism, if we're going to rely on the Atlantic bubble for next year, as one scenario would suggest, we're going to have a 12-month season, not a 4-month season. So what you do with winter activities, how you address festivals and events and community celebrations of different kinds, that's important. I know one of your colleagues asked a question around restrictions and how they connect to the economy. That is part of the discussion, one way or the other, and those things factor in. So I can say without a doubt, the tourism sector has been very patient with us, for sure. They're facing life and death in terms of their economic viability. They do certainly expect and look to the financial supports that we'll provide, but there are policy pieces as well, and understanding that tourism, the government's role in tourism is way larger than marketing. It was before COVID, but certainly now it becomes about that market development, again, in terms of the Four Seasons. It becomes about what antiquated legislation do we have that prohibits certain tourism activities, and what financial measures, again, we can take to reduce the burden and make sure that they stay alive. So that's really where we are.
Jean, go ahead with your follow-up.
Yeah, just briefly, what does, because people will want to know what they should expect from this government in terms of additional aid. So what does keeping them afloat look like to a restaurant owner, to a motel owner, to somebody who has a seasonal business?
Well, I think it becomes, and this is where the tourism sector sort of becomes intertwined with many of those who are under the public closure order. So again, think of using restaurants as the example. It depends where they are in terms of their fiscal position, the size of their budget, and what the demands are. Again, for me, from day one, the initial feedback, advice, lobbying that became crystal clear was, you can do whatever you want with loans. We need cash. So for some groups, cash is king, as the expression goes, and that was helpful to some. Again, Jean, to sit here and suggest that was the savior and we can continue to do that, or there's value in continuing to do that, I can't say that for sure, but for some it is. Then again, as we've discussed in the past, and some of what'll be the focal point of the Dow 50 million is just around what type of supports can we give for some of those larger employers, and what is it that they need. So is it a balance sheet sort of relief? Is it a direct investment by way of loan? Are they being denied from commercial banks, and it has to be some kind of public dollar support? All of those things are going to be conversations moving forward. And to answer the question, this 50 million is not going to be the solution for everybody and everything in tourism. So this isn't going to be the last conversation. It's not going to be, here's the 50 million, good luck with everything, we're out of this conversation, because it's not going to be the case. We're going to be asked to and be responding to tourism supports and accommodation supports and service sector supports for years. There's no two ways about it.
And that's all the time we have for Minister McClellan. For those on the phones, we now have Minister Wilson, and I have LaRoche on the phone with questions for Wilson. Is that all? Okay, hearing nobody else, we'll go to the room.
Minister, I want to ask a question on behalf of a colleague. Was public opposition to aerial glyphosate spraying, will that public opposition, I should say, be considered when issuing permits next season, given that some spraying was entirely shut down because of protest efforts?
So the application process for glyphosate spraying follows the Health Canada guidelines pretty strictly. So we would take all of those applications and ensure that the guidelines that they have in place for setbacks, for notification of adjacent boundary, landowners, conditions for when they can spray, reporting, and all that is adhered to, and those are the guidelines that we're required to follow and do follow.
I guess what I'm wondering, though, is in light of the fact that it appears that 4 spraying attempts were effectively canceled because of the protesters, do you feel like the application process ought to include some type of public consultation component or something like that to gauge whether or not there's social license to even do it in the first place?
And again, so the directives on how we would assess these applications would come from Health Canada, and I think that would be a good question for them to answer, and we would follow their direction on that. Those permits were not canceled, by the way. Those were permits that just were not acted on by the company.
Right, sorry, I misspoke there. Bringing it into the realm of your own department, are there any takeaways from those 4 sessions that weren't able to go forward that you have that you think ought to be considered or applied to future spraying applications, or even the way the province in general handles spraying?
I think if there's one takeaway that I could take, and this would be broad across almost any decision that we make, is a complete understanding of what is done and why it's done. So guidelines that we would follow, directions that we would be given by another entity that is ultimately responsible. It's important for people to know that these are the conditions and the criteria that are followed. Sometimes there's a lack of communication on what actually are the restrictions on carrying out any activity, and what things are there to protect the general public and to ensure that it's done in a safe manner.
Thanks.
Sorry, just going to the phones. Jen, I think that you're off mute. Going to LaRoche for his questions for Minister Wilson.
Oh, God. Jen, you're not on mute. We're hearing her whole, anyway. All right, Minister, briefly, and I'm going to butcher the name of this company, Per Day, I believe it's called, is pressing ahead with plans to build an LNG plant in Guysborough. As you know, these kind of plants are large emitters of greenhouse gases. Does the province have an agreement yet with the company on its GHG emissions?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Jean, do you have a follow-up for Minister Wilson?
Go ahead, and the provinces, in light of the province's commitment to lowering GHG emissions.
I didn't catch the first of that.
Can you repeat your whole question,
What I'm
Jean?
trying to get at is, in light of the fact that you don't have a deal with this company, what does it mean in terms of their operations in Nova Scotia and your commitment to lower greenhouse gases?
So our greenhouse gas initiatives in our cap and trade program is a province-wide one. I think in light of that, we're always looking for opportunities to continue to meet those targets by finding other ways that we can reduce our emissions. So at any point in time, we're always looking at ways that we can continue to meet those targets, which are pretty firm, by either reductions or eliminating polluters.
Jean, do you have any more questions for Minister Wilson?
Is there sufficient room under the cap and trade system to accommodate an LNG plant?
Currently, at this time, I would say that might be a challenging opportunity there, but at the same time, again, as we move forward in this, our greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, we heard some fairly significant conversations just recently around electrification that deal with these sort of things. So it's a moving target, but we'll always look at opportunities to reduce and again hold those targets.
Okay, that's all the questions we have for Minister Wilson. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. There's been basically radio silence on 2 major inquiries, the Desmond inquiry and, of course, the mass shooting inquiry. Can you give us a status update on both, where they stand, and for instance, in the case of the Desmond inquiry, how close are we to restarting those hearings?
The Desmond inquiry, as we speak, court services within the Department of Justice continues to work with the inquiry. Obviously, COVID circumstances have presented the same challenges in an inquiry environment as they have in the judicial court process. So court services are working with the inquiry. Ultimately, it will be the decision of Judge Zimmer, who is the commissioner for the inquiry, who will determine when it starts. But that work continues, and it is towards a new start date. With regards to the...
Can I just stop you there? Sorry to do that, but in terms of the Desmond inquiry, is the problem with COVID the size of the venue? Is that the main thing? It was in a small area, in a small room, as I recall.
Yeah, it's a pretty restricted space, so they're looking at what they're able to do with that space, and if not that space, an alternate space. If I may, to your second point on the federal inquiry, staff within legal services in Department of Justice continue to work with their colleagues in the federal government. That work continues. It's a priority for both of our governments. As I indicated in our last cabinet out, both the federal minister and I have confirmed our support of a third candidate for the panel, and the federal government continues that administrative vetting process so that both the federal government and the provincial government can advance their orders in council to cabinets for approval.
How close are we to on that in terms of that, and also the confirmation of the third member?
That's a question best directed to the federal government on the third member. I'm not going to get into timelines other than to say it's a priority for both the federal and provincial government.
Minister, today you announced, or your department announced the development of a satellite court in Dartmouth. What's the timeline for getting those open and operational?
So obviously there will be a contract with the landlord. We're anticipating that will be signed off in the early part of November. It will allow for immediate construction and renovations of 22,000 square feet of that space for 2 jury trials. Courtrooms, and consistent with the announcement by Chief Justice Smith of the Supreme Court Trial Division, trials to commence early in the new year.
Have you been given a sense of to what degree that will help with this backlog that is starting to mount and presents, as you know, a very real concern on a number of fronts?
Certainly. We've worked very close with the judiciary in finding alternate space to meet their needs. As we speak, there's approximately 35 jury trials in HRM alone. I believe 12 or 13 of those are homicide trials. So the significance of finding alternate space has been a priority for both the judiciary and us, working close with Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, who are responsible for our infrastructure, and very conscious of the 30-month timeline that the Supreme Court of Canada identified in that Supreme Court decision. So we're confident in discussions with the judiciary that the establishment of these 2 satellite jury trial courtrooms will meet their needs.
Have you heard from Mr. Cacchione yet regarding the Assoon referral to CERT?
I have forwarded correspondence requesting a review of the circumstances by CERT, and I'm awaiting a formal response from the director.
He said that would make a decision by the end of the week. Is that your understanding as well?
I heard that through the media. That's correct.
We just go back to the Desmond. I'm just wondering, are there any talks of moving the inquiry from Guysborough County? Because I believe there was quite a bit of money done to kind of revamp that space in order to have the inquiry there, but it's so small. Are you now looking at moving to a different location, and what impact could that have on proceedings?
I haven't been part of the discussions between court services and the inquiry. All those options would be looked at. Are we able to modify the existing space to meet the needs of the inquiry? And if not, the need to identify an alternate site, but those are part of the discussions that are taking place as we look to reconvene, as the Commissioner looks to reconvene the Desmond inquiry.
Just wondering, the Premier had said that you're waiting on the federal government with respect to the shooting inquiry. Does that mean that the province has finished its terms of reference?
We're waiting on the federal government for the final approval of vetting of the third panelist. As I indicated earlier, both the federal government and the provincial government, through our legal services division, continue to prioritize this matter, and that includes both the terms of reference and the order in council. That's moving as quickly as we can possibly move it.
What's the cost sharing? Is there a cost sharing sort of agreement here that the province is going to pay a certain amount of money for the inquiry, and the federal government will pay obviously the majority? But is there an agreement?
We've agreed in principle to cost share 50-50. There may be further discussions around specific costs, but we recognize this is a joint inquiry, and we respect and recognize each other's responsibility.
Does the federal government ultimately have the last say on what is in the terms of reference?
No. You had asked that question in a previous cabinet out, and I had indicated to you at that time. This is a joint inquiry where our legal services continue to advance the necessary documents to ensure that the inquiry is stood up as effectively and efficiently as possible, to ensure that the panel is able to ask the questions that are necessary and to get the answers.
So when can the public expect that the terms of reference will be completed and released?
As soon as possible. I'm not attaching a timeline.
We're going to the phones to Jennifer Henderson with the Halifax Examiner. Line? Okay, going to Jean Laroche.
Minister.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Okay, Jen, go ahead. I'll come back to you, Jean.
Okay, Minister Fiore, we learned in July that the cost to the province for its share of the RCMP investigation into the mass shooting had hit $3.2 million in July. Can you tell us what the current year-to-date cost is for the RCMP investigation?
I don't know where that number came from, Jennifer. I haven't heard that. As you know, the provincial police service agreement between the province and the federal government is a 70-30% cost share. I don't have those numbers available to me. That's a question best directed to the RCMP.
Jen, go ahead with your follow-up.
Is the 70% provincial or federal, please?
70% is provincial.
Next question going to Jean Laroche with CBC.
Minister, as you know, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has decided that a review is proper to determine whether your long history with the RCMP puts you in a conflict to deal with the fatality inquiry. How do you feel about that?
I think I can't speak for the commissioner, but he is acting on a complaint. He has reviewed, obviously, the preliminary information that he's received, and he's deemed there's more work to do. I'll allow the commissioner to finish his work and continue to be guided by his advice.
Go ahead with your follow-up, Sean.
Letter from Joseph Kennedy inviting you to respond in a written response 2 weeks ago. What have you told the commissioner?
I haven't talked to the commissioner and have not responded at this point. We did respond to the commissioner advising that we would be providing a response in the very near future.
That's all the time that we have questions for Minister Fury.
Before we get into some other things, I was wondering if we
could ask you about the leadership. I've heard a lot of Liberals saying that you've been making calls, or people have been making calls on your behalf about a possible leadership run. Are you going to seek the leadership of the Liberal Party?
I think we'll just defer that question maybe to the end, and just focus on the department questions first, and I'll just pick that one up at the end.
Any questions about Department of Health and Wellness?
All right, let's go to lead then. A lot of schools in Nova Scotia have been found to have water that exceeds the allowable limit of lead content. What are your concerns with this?
Well, I think that refers to the water source in the schools, but the Department of Education actually ensures that there's water supply for staff and students that is appropriate for drinking and purposes that meet the needs. So they're doing what needs to be done, and as far as any infrastructure changes that need to be made to address the, I guess, original sources of water, that's work that falls under the Department of Education and Transportation Infrastructure Renewal from an infrastructure perspective.
Minister, there are some concerns on Briar Island and Long Island about the lack of presence of ambulances, that basically, according to residents, they're spending much more time on the mainland than they have in the past. What have you heard about that? What, if any, concerns do you have about accessibility and, in particular, response time when it comes to ambulances serving that part of the province?
That's a really important question, especially for residents in that area. And I've had conversations over the last couple of weeks with the MLA from Digby, Minister Wilson, who brought those questions forward, or some questions about that. So I've engaged staff to dig in and ascertain exactly what the historical shifts may have been. I can confirm that there's been no structural changes, no policy changes to facilities and operations there. So that means the work now to understand, what concerns are being brought forward now, and from the community about services and service levels, that we're just doing a deeper dive to see what the data shows about those concerns, and we'll continue the conversation with Minister Wilson and communicate with his community about how that's going.
What has been the message that Minister Wilson has brought to you about that situation?
Very much like you just highlighted, that concerns from the community about service levels. They're indicating observationally certain what they believe are changes. I think there were some suggestions that there were changes to the system and policies of how it operated. So that was the first question that I went up, and that's why it takes a little bit of time. You hear something from a constituent, and an MLA brings it forward. So you dig in, and the first question was, were there any changes? And I was assured that the last time there were changes was back in 2012 or 13, as part of a broad change going from 24 to 12-hour shifts, and that was a broader system-wide change to have 12-hour shifts for paramedics for health and safety reasons.
Minister, a number of weeks ago, we were told there was a potential COVID reinfection case in Nova Scotia, and that would have been, it's quite significant. There was a lot of national interest because it might have been the first case in Canada. We've heard nothing about it since. What is your understanding of what the test results have shown, and where does that stand?
Well, actually, we did a couple of weeks ago have questions about that, even after the specific individual's case was deemed resolved by public health. And the circumstances are that the process by which clinicians, public health, identify whether something's a reinfection is fairly detailed. So our officials are working with the national officials, haven't confirmed that it is a reinfection, but rather that the work is ongoing to come to a conclusion. But they also acknowledge that given the newness of this virus and the circumstances, they may never actually determine with absolute certainty that it is. So they've been processing the test results to determine. As you noted, there's very few documented cases deemed reinfections worldwide. So it is unique, but it's continuing to be investigated.
Will there be some kind of definitive statement that you will issue, given the level of interest in this and the fact that, I mean, anytime I've asked about it, I've been met with a wall of silence, not even the slightest detail or any indication of what's happening with it.
Well, I think probably most likely would be certainly if there was determined to be a case of reinfection, that would likely result in some public communication as to the fact that is determined if it's confirmed to be a case of reinfection. But in the absence of confirmation, I don't know when we would find a time to say that there's something to provide, because we may never get definitive results on that investigation.
Sure, you could say that too. I mean, we need to have a result one way or the other, because I'm constantly being bombarded by questions from people elsewhere who want to know what's happening in Nova Scotia with this case. Do you understand that we probably do need some public disclosure on how it's either resolved or not resolved?
Sure. Again, as I've said, it's with the health officials, both provincially and nationally, doing the investigation on that. It's down that stream more in the research realm to make that determination. So I'll check in to see what the latest status, but what I guess I can assure you is if it had been confirmed, that would be something that I would know and would have been communicated. But I'm not watching every day. I'm waiting for the confirmation if they get to that point.
One of the challenges Dr. Strang identified with this case in the first place is that when the person first tested positive and was eventually deemed resolved, they never produced a negative test. They were never tested again. I understand that this person is once again deemed resolved, but as a matter of precaution, were they ever given a follow-up test to definitively show that they were COVID negative?
I think the protocols within public health deem what steps they go through to come to the determination of when someone's case is resolved. I don't delve in on the individual treatments of each individual person that goes through the process, so I can't answer the question if they definitively.
You don't know definitively?
I don't know definitively if they did do the test or not, because it is something conducted, and it is a clinical process that public health follows.
Minister, just to follow up on that, though, should there be should we change the policy so that anyone who is confirmed positive in the province does get tested and get a negative test? Because otherwise, we're going to keep having cases that we won't know if they're reinfected or not if they never tested negative to begin with.
So I will, again, getting into the clinical aspects of the policy here, so I will make some statements and follow up with public health for confirmation if I misspeak. But my understanding is the way the testing works and identifies the existence of the virus and or antibodies in your system, you may still have presence after being resolved and are no longer presenting symptoms or communicable. I believe the consensus from a public health perspective around having the negative test to determine being a resolved case actually stems from the fact that, by and large, that test is not what determines that an individual case is resolved and that they can re-engage in the community. There may still continue to exist and trigger a positive result while not being a risk to themselves or others' health.
Heading to the phones, I'm going to go to Jean Laroche with CBC.
The Nursing Homes of Nova Scotia Association wants your government to delay its plan to pull funding from long-term care facilities that have, in the eyes of your department, an excess number of open beds. The group says it needs to see a concrete plan for dealing with wave 2 of COVID before its members will fill the beds that your department wants to fill. How do you feel about that request, and will you fulfill that request to hold off on pulling funding?
So I just want to clarify what the circumstances being referred to are. We have allowed facilities, as I've previously spoken, to maintain some vacancies to allow for what could be considered a COVID unit, so that in the event of an outbreak at a long-term care facility, that infected residents can be isolated safely in that space. And we continue to pay for those vacant beds, even though they are vacant. What has transpired is that vacancy rate has continued to grow over the course of time and beyond what was considered to be necessary for COVID response. Excuse me. For a COVID response unit. And so that is the work that we've been undertaking as a department with our partners in the long-term care facilities to let them know that we still have residents across this province who require the services provided by their facilities. So we recognize the need to maintain and we continue to pay for those vacancies so that facilities can respond to a COVID outbreak, but we do need facilities to also provide the services for which we're paying for. So what we've really indicated is if they are not able or not willing to provide services that they have capacity to provide, then the people of Nova Scotia need those financial resources to be redirected to other locations or facilities that are willing to provide those care services for those Nova Scotians in need.
Jean, go ahead with your follow-up.
So you didn't actually answer my question. So they want you to hold off on pulling funding. Will you do that?
At this point, we have a process in place. We've given, and we believe that they have capacity to fill. So that, I believe, stands. If individual facilities have individual or unique circumstances, they can certainly, as always, reach out and have some conversations with the department. And as it relates to the plan for Wave 2, our staff have been engaged regularly, including, I think, as recently as Thursday or Friday of last week, and then possibly even again earlier this week on the plan, and their information and feedback was solicited, and so it's really just their feedback that's being finalized into kind of a documented plan that they would see. So while they may be looking for something formally documented, I believe the sector is well aware of what this plan is that we have for Wave 2.
Going to Jennifer Henderson. Jennifer, do you have questions for Mr. Delory?
Yes, just following up on Jean's point, the infection prevention and control review showed that about 58% of long-term care homes have shared rooms, and we know that shared rooms can be an issue when there's flu or COVID-19 in a facility. So why is the government refusing to pay for a certain percentage of empty rooms?
Sorry, I just missed the actual question at the end. Why are we?
Well, I understood your response to Jean was to say that, the government can't afford to pay for empty beds when the beds are needed. And yet we've got this situation where in the case of a bad flu or COVID outbreak, the double bunking will have the infection move like wildfire. So why can't you, pay to hold some empty beds on these, to improve infection control?
Thank you, Jennifer. I believe in my response to Mr. LaRoche, I did indicate that we are still maintaining and paying for vacancy within facilities across the province to ensure they have that there is capacity to respond to a COVID outbreak. So we're ensuring that we are providing that space and resources to isolate and help mitigate any spread during an outbreak outbreak situation. What I've indicated, the circumstances before us is that many facilities have really allowed their vacancy rate to go far beyond any anticipated need at those facilities, while we have many Nova Scotians who need those services. And we as a government have a responsibility to work with our providers to balance the delivery of those cares in a safe way, and that's why we continue to provide those vacant beds. But we do need the excess vacancy to start being filled to meet the needs of Nova Scotians.
That's all the time we have for Minister Deloy. We'll go back to Brian's question.
Just to tighten that up, what is the average vacancy rate in the province? You're aiming for 3%, but what is it right now?
So right now, I'd have to double check the final numbers, but I believe it's upwards of 9%. I'll double check that and get back to you for sure. If I'm off on that, I'll have someone follow up with you.
Thank you. And yeah, on the leadership, if you could.
I can confirm that there's certainly been a lot of interest expressed to me and encouragement to pursue the Liberal leadership and indeed to fulfill the role as Premier. I can also confirm that I am giving it serious consideration, but a decision has not been made, and I would anticipate that I'll have more to say next week.
Well, it's got to be next week. The deadline's a week from tomorrow, so thanks.
Mister, in regards to the lead water, you promised a public database, but instead you just published 8 PDFs. So I'm just wondering why there isn't an actual database that was promised.
That would be the database that was published yesterday.
So, but you understand that there's a difference, right, between 8 PDFs and a database? Because a database would be searchable, it would be you'd be able to access historical data.
I don't see a difference. There's a database of information that's provided. It's going to be managed and updated at the regional level, and we will have links to that database through our provincial website as well.
Is it going to include historical data and be searchable?
What's I'm not following. I mean, you can search the database. There's information on the thousands of taps that we tested, and that information will be updated as well as there's new information that becomes available.
Minister, what's the plan? How many of these schools, about a third of them...
Nice to see you back.
Nice to see you. About a third of the tests you did, 14,000, failed. Do you know how many of those have been remediated already? Which are you going to target first? What's the timeline? What's the plan?
So just a reminder, water was provided to every single school in January, so students have had access to water. We have found under the new guidelines, exceedances. The remediation will depend on the nature of the problem. So that can vary from the tap itself to pipes to the source water. So we'll continue to provide water to students until the remediation happens. We are getting close to procuring touchless water fountains as well. So that will be coming down the pipe fairly shortly. Any issues related to the taps themselves, the drinking taps, that will fix that problem. And the regions will deal with the remediation depending on what the problem is. As appropriate, and communities will be updated. And any taps will continue to be retested as well, in line with our regulations quarterly, and updates to the database will be provided quarterly as well.
Do you have an idea of what it's going to cost yet?
No, not yet, no. But we will know what the procurement, once the procurement's out for the touchless faucets. I mean, there'll be a price associated with that, but I don't know what the full cost is going to be. And there's going to be some cases where, it's not going to be remediation, but bottled water will continue to be provided.
How are you going to ensure that when you go to procurement for those new water fountains that you don't end up with water fountains with lead in them?
Make sure that there's there's new ones available now that won't be a problem, and they'll also be very COVID friendly as well, being touchless.
Minister, I just I mean, harp on this too much, but I just want to see if there's an update for the case.
Yes, names have been submitted to the process, so we hope to have the updated list of participants on case coming in the near future. I'm not sure the exact number, but we will get to at or above quorum in this round of appointments.
What's quorum?
I'll get someone to follow up with you on quorum.
There's 17 seats, up to the maximum 17 seats. How many of the seats do you want to see, or are you trying to fill, or what's the goal?
Well, our goal is to eventually have them all filled.
Why is the provincial council continuously filled, but this case is not? It's not even. I mean, a third of the seats are filled. I mean, why is one council and the other council so different, right? Why?
It was just a matter of timing. So the PACE appointments were completed before COVID, and when we hit COVID, everything else really got pushed to the back burner. And we're playing some catch up right now with CASE and some other files as well in the department.
I'm going to go to the phones to Elizabeth McSheffrey. Liz, do you still have questions for Minister Churchill?
Hi, Minister. Given the widespread number of lead exceedances that we see in the data, and the fact that many of the schools on municipal systems were not tested for lead prior to this year and were not provided bottled water prior to last year, I think it's a safe assumption that at some point students and staff in many schools drank water that had lead in it. What's your message to parents, teachers, staff, kids that, likely at some point took a sip from a fountain that had lead?
I think it's really important not to be an alarmist over this issue. I mean, I'll remind everybody that we have been in line with the federal guidelines around lead exceedances, and Nova Scotia is one of the leaders in the country in terms of addressing this issue. So we have always been within those guidelines previously. And we are in the process of ensuring that we're going to be following the new guidelines as well. So previously before the exceedance levels were lowered by Health Canada, we are under their previous health and safety guidelines, and so Nova Scotians should take comfort in that, and that we've been following those guidelines. Again, they're not mandated. Not every province is making moves on addressing this issue either. Nova Scotia is. I'm the only province that I'm aware of that provided bottled water when the new exceedance levels came out, and we're committing to remediation on every single tap that requires remediation on.
Elizabeth, go ahead with your follow-up.
Respectfully, Minister, we don't know whether all Nova Scotia schools were in compliance with that guideline before because they weren't tested at the taps inside the schools. And we know that some schools on municipal systems had lead exceedances that were dramatically above even the old health guideline of 10. So we can't say that we were always in compliance. We don't know that. What's your response to that?
We have been in compliance. We conduct testing on a quarterly basis, and the exceedant levels have changed, and we're adjusting our strategy to meet the new guidelines.
Minister, you can't say that with any kind of confidence. There's a school, Gatesbrook Junior High, 920 times the new Health Canada guideline. So it was 450 times the old Health Canada guideline. You weren't testing the schools. So how can you say that they were in compliance?
We chatted with Public Health on this. They haven't indicated that there has been a health and safety concern. If you do want to question the health and safety on this, you can question it with Public Health, but we don't believe there's reason for the public to be alarmed over this.
And that's all the questions we have for Mr. Churchill.
The Nova Scotia Sports Hall of Fame is moving from the Scotiabank Centre to a new location. I'm wondering what are your thoughts on that, first of all?
I was first of all surprised to hear that a deal couldn't work out on the rent side for the Hall of Fame. However, it has a good advantage in the part of the city it's located, but I feel there's a great opportunity here for a new venue that will allow the memorabilia of sports, many who are our sport heroes, if you wish, through many decades of sport culture in our province. So I think a new opportunity awaits here. We, of course, provide operational grant support to the Hall of Fame, so we're very, very interested in making sure they get a home as soon as possible, as this is one of those, iconic places that impacts really all of Nova Scotia, since we have athletes in there from all parts of the province. They get a very high number of visitors each year. So, yes, I think there's an opportunity awaiting us here, and we'll be looking forward to supporting in what way may be necessary.
Is there a concern that if this has to close down and could be closed down for an extended period of time, you're going to lose a lot of those visitors, a lot of income coming into that?
Well, that is a worry, anytime a facility closes for a period of time. However, the current displays and programs will be able to continue virtually. So during this COVID time, we will have the hall continuing to make its mark on the province, and I certainly love its education program that is offered to the schools across our province. And so I think virtually, now that we're getting into more of this as part of our daily lives, the hall can continue to have that kind of presence in the province. So I think we'll do fine in the short term. I'd worry more if it goes on for an extended period.
Minister, do you see an opportunity, when you talk about opportunity, do you anticipate that your department will have to get involved in some way, whether it's in helping them find a home or perhaps even towards construction of a new home?
Well, all of that remains a question mark at the moment. I know the board and the team there have started with HRM to look for a suitable place that may be available with some modifications. So they've begun the process, but it's very, very early days at this stage. But it's place even for people who come into the province as tourists. And I think Bruce Rainey said it best. There are people who get off the cruise ships and make a beeline to the Sports Hall of Fame to see the famous dryer that Sidney Crosby honed his shot on. So it does have a wider appeal than sometimes we may think in terms of a record of our history. But there are a number of current and playing and performing athletes that are already in the Hall of Fame. So it has a presence about it that is both current, but brings us back to some of the glory days of teams and individuals who've been in the spotlight of sport in our province for a long time.
Not to flog this too much, in fairness to you, as you said, you've only just found out about this, but do you think you even have capacity to help, given that you've got an art gallery that you're trying to build and several other pretty expensive initiatives going on in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, we are closing in on the fact that there are limitations in terms of what we can do. Certainly, the desire to support, but we'll have to see the kind of floor space that they will need for a modern Hall of Fame, and then we'll evaluate and assess at that particular time.
That concludes cabinet outs for today.